There wouldn't be any more soldiers to battle if they began to think. The Russian army's leaders and top officials have now begun to align themselves with Ukraine after adopting this concept. Because everyone participates in conflict, only honorable people favor peace. The Russian commanders now decided to support the Ukrainian armed forces and declared that they would fight for Ukraine on the front lines because they thought that the Ukrainian people's fight was the correct one. Yes, this marked the start of a protracted period of rebellion. Such dissolutions have been occurring within the Russian force for a while now, but nobody anticipated that the rebellion process would intensify as much as it has. With his comments, a Russian commander who spearheaded this uprising in the Russian army shook the status quo. Let's examine the exploits of the Russian general who entered the Ukrainian military. Only 2 days after the war in Ukraine started, a Russian commander joined the Ukrainian army and declared that he would battle for his country until the conflict was resolved. The Russian commander was most impressed when he realized that the Ukrainian force was a true people's army. Because there were many common workers and business executives, parents and their kids, teachers, theater performers, and new college graduates among the Ukrainian army's ranks at the start of the conflict, this Russian commander also spoke with genuine emotion about his experiences as he witnessed private clinic directors leaving their positions to take command, medical units in combat brigades at the front, wedding photographers switching to aerial photo reconnaissance, and bartenders becoming artillery. It could be said that the Ukrainian army was composed of a company leader in the Donetsk Oblast, a reconnaissance sergeant near Zaporizhia, and a Forbes number 88 man near Kharkiv. In order to defend their nation and re-establish its prior independence, the Ukrainians established an all-out popular power. The Ukrainian force has increased in size by at least 3 times in the last year. 2 or 3 freshly mobilized individuals were present for every professional soldier. People who worked in civilian occupations contributed their knowledge and abilities to the Ukrainian army. There was a favorable climate for developing new strategies for resolving issues among the Ukrainian soldiers because no official from that country stated that it could not be done for the popular force in his army. Senior Russian army commanders and numerous Russian troops were drawn to this natural setting and openly backed the legitimate Ukrainian defense war. The Ukrainian military required bottom-up initiative, motivation, and horizontal structures to accomplish this impact. The mobilization strengthened the Ukrainian force in this way. However, this cannot be said of the Russian military. Moscow only used the Russian troops it had mobilized as pawns in an invasion of Ukraine. If you recall, the freshly mobilized Russian army soldiers had to endure extremely trying circumstances. They were unable to eat properly, and their resting arrangements were unhygienic. Due to all of these factors, a number of Russian military leaders have now declared that they will support the Ukrainian army with their forces. Other Russian army commanders and soldiers were also drawn in by these startling remarks. You are aware that the Free Russian Legion is a sizable combat division in the Ukrainian army. More than half of the individuals who make up this union are Russian or Belarusian citizens, and even some Russian Legion members are former soldiers or leaders. Their involvement in the Free Russian Legion group has also increased as a result of the Russian commanders' comments that they will enlist in the Ukrainian army and fight for the Ukrainians. Because a single spark can ignite a large fire, a group of Russian commanders and their troops sided with the Ukrainian army, which is how all of this came to pass. In actuality, this is the only distinction between the fight in Ukraine and other conflicts. Any conflict in the previous 40 years is nothing like the war in Ukraine. Since the Falkland Islands, Iran, and Iraq, guerrilla movements and conventional armies have traditionally engaged in most conflicts. It was a straightforward arrangement, with light infantry, mortars, and grenade launchers on one side and tanks, artillery, and aircraft on the other. Conflicts in the area typically went in that direction, but the Ukraine-Russia war is an exception. We are currently watching the collision of 2 full-scale military machines for the first time in many years. Both possess every tool. Air defense and aircraft armor are used by both parties. On the front lines, regular army versus regular army combat. The globe is not accustomed to this. Everyone likely believed that the Ukrainian army wouldn't be able to repel the Russian assault and that it would disintegrate into guerrilla groups. As a result, it was more likely that the weapons sent to Ukraine would be useful in an uprising. Things take a different turn, and as of right now, Ukraine is considering purchasing aircraft and missiles that can strike targets inside the occupied area. However, the scale and disparity are still apparent. Russia does not keep track of its casualties and keeps up its mobilization. Ukraine was forced to play the role of David against a combative Goliath. The Kremlin probably believes that they have an excessive advantage in resources and wants to win a war through attrition. We are aware that this conflict will destroy all of the Eastern Europe-based Soviet arsenal. The entire region will now adopt Western tanks, planes, and artillery simply because there is no other option. Of course, for the time being, we still frequently observe Soviet weapons at the front, but we believe their depletion is imminent. Stocks in Ukraine are not limitless, and the war's ferocity does not lessen. Russia, on the other hand, wanted to partition Ukraine from the start of the conflict. They aimed to close the divide between the military and political leaders as well as between the west and east of the nation. Putin urged the Ukrainian generals to seize control for themselves. Its propagandists maintained that the civilian population of Ukraine was deprived of electricity and water because of the Ukrainian army's refusal to surrender. Moscow attempted to divide Ukraine, but the situation is now the opposite. For decades, the Russians insisted, as if by inertia, on regarding the Second World War as the most significant war in their history in order to divide Ukraine. In every family there was someone who fought, just as in every family there is someone who fell prey to clashes or invasions during the war. Now Russia is doing everything to make this conflict the most important war ever for the Ukrainians. But if you're in Ukraine right now, you can't help but notice the war when Russian missiles hit towns and cities far from the front. Everyone in Ukraine now has a connection to the family of a dead soldier, typically less than 6 degrees apart. Volunteering for the army has become the rule, not the exception. So the idea that everyone in Russia in World War II was a soldier is really present in the Ukrainians right now. There are hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the trenches. In these circumstances, it doesn't matter what your language is. Differences become secondary. The past surrenders to the present. The occupation by Russia has forced Ukraine to confront some existential questions, and now the country is responding in perfect solidarity. Symbolically, the Russians almost pushed Ukraine to be in solidarity with each other. This destroys the usual nonsense about the difference between Ukraine's east and west. Ultimately, the sociology of any war is more or less the same. When decisions are taken jointly and popular power is combined, the potential for success in war increases. But in Russia, as before, all decisions now belong to Vladimir Putin. Most likely, Putin considers the war the culmination of his time in power. The outcome of this war will be his political legacy. This means that there is no reason for him to stop the invasion. But the Russian leader has reset everything he has. I was trying not to lose it, so it's best to be prepared for the war not to end in 2023. On the other hand, although we continue to monitor how effective the sanctions are, they will not separate Russian society from the Russian leadership. Impact is measured by economists, not sociologists. The less money Russia has in its war chest, the less ability it has to attack. If the economic impact becomes unbearable, yes, then we can see Putin completely cut off from the Russian people. By this reckoning, Western sanctions and Russia's corruption are seen as almost a second front aiding Ukraine. Ultimately, this war will completely shape the continent, set rules, and draw borders. Books will be written and studies will be done on the reality we face today. Surprisingly, after an operation from Ukraine to the airspace over Crimea, the Russian army is at a loss. With this, Putin is literally cornered. There is nowhere left for the Russian army to escape in Crimea. But the local population in Crimea also supports Ukraine. Russian troops started to withdraw. With this withdrawal, the Ukrainian army was surprised. What to do? In the Russian-Ukrainian war, many advantages for Ukraine began to emerge in response to these achievements of the Ukrainian army. Russia is at a loss. What Russia would do after this operation in Crimea was not fully understood, but a great fear gripped Russian positions because of the policies that Ukraine would follow in response. With this fear, Russians tried to flee from Crimea, but Putin did not allow it. Immediately after the right by the Ukrainian army, the end was near for Russia. But until now, Crimeans have never reacted to Russia this much. With this latest operation, Russia's empire will fear Crimea has collapsed for the first time since the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, and there has been such a massive reaction against the Russian occupiers. Aware of the situation, Ukrainian soldiers gave Crimeans great hope with the latest operation. But everything went haywire when Putin decided to put a diabolical plan into action. Putin's policies against the Crimeans in the context of the mega mobilization have received a huge reaction all over the world. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that he would never end the war without taking the Crimean territories from Russia. Following these statements, thanks to the Ukrainian army's robust operations, Russia's dominance in this region has been brought to an end. This critical air base was the base that supported all the teams that went into Ukrainian territory as well as the airplanes that carried out the bombing. This has shattered Russia's authority in Crimea. First of all, the Ukrainian army found out that there had been Bombing from this air base for a long time, the players in this area were constantly attacking the Ukrainian army and preventing it from taking any steps. So the Ukrainian army sent directors to this area to gather intelligence. However, as soon as the Bear actors entered this area, many of them were destroyed by the air defense systems, so they were unable to gather sufficient intelligence. Therefore, the Ukrainian army sent a special unit to this area. Many of Ukraine's advantages were created precisely because of this unit. But first of all, this unit implanted a chip in one of the airplanes to determine where the air base was located. This not only directly revealed the location of the air base but also clarified many questions about how to conduct an operation in the mapped area. It was time for the Ukrainian army to act. Ukrainian Special Forces units were deployed in this area in order to ensure an easy operation. Many rounds of ammunition were given to these soldiers, and they were sent to a region far away from the Russian headquarters. The Ukrainian Special Forces first had to drive away from Russian warplanes in this area. This was possible by simultaneously operating characters in a nearby area. In order to get a place to take off, the Bayraktar started shelling one of the military headquarters in the area. He ranked this highly. The Russian military immediately sent fighter jets over Bayraktar. Then Bayraktars received this intelligence. They began to retreat towards the Patriot range. When Ukrainian Special Forces ensured that there were no planes or pilots left in the area, they organized a quick operation and neutralized those at the airport. Immediately afterwards, they moved to detonate the ammunition from the Russian planes. The troops, who brought a large number of C4s with them, started lining up C4s in the ammunition depots of the Russian military headquarters. At the same time, the fighter jets chasing the Tabarak doors began to retreat to avoid being in range. Immediately after this chaos in the air, the Ukrainian Special Forces began to move back towards Ukraine to use remote-controlled explosives. When the Ukrainian Special Forces pressed the remote control, the most critical air base in this region was blown up. After this incident, Russian warplanes did not know where to land, so they did not know what to do. The Russian jets headed for the nearest airport, and since they did not know exactly what Ukraine would do, they fell into a very big trap in this region as well. The Patriots were brought to this area. It was determined that if the plan went according to plan, the Russian jets would start flying back. One by one, fighter jets within the range of the Patriots began to be shut down. The fighter jets that had sent word to the Kremlin were at a loss. Russian pilots who were about to jump out of the planes were in great trouble with this move. The Ukrainian Air Force once again showed the world the importance of a simultaneous operation, but at this point, with two weapons. The shipment to Ukraine is a successful exit from this operation. The first of these were the characters that gave Ukraine's Air Force and bombardments great quality from the very beginning. With the latest announcement, this event was brought to a completely different point. Turkey made a shocking decision and announced that it would open a barracks near a factory in Ukraine. While this situation had great repercussions all over the world, it showed the whole world that Ukraine will now continue the war from a different angle. After Barak doors, Turkey took action to reach a very big agreement on the Red Apples, which will be released as unmanned aerial jets. This situation allowed us to handle all the problems in a different way with the Russian army. In such a desperate situation, victory for the Ukrainian soldiers is now seen as imminent. Another weapon that came to Ukraine and changed the nature of this operation was the long-range Patriots. The long-range Patriots, one of the weapons that the United States had said at the beginning of the war that they would never give to Ukraine, were delivered to Ukraine thanks to Russia's unstable policies. This paved the way for a different characterization of the Ukrainian army. Russia's ability to threaten nuclear war in many respects and to completely change the peace environment has led to a major crisis all over the world. In the aftermath of this crisis, the Russian military now has to face great difficulties. In many respects, World War III is being discussed again, especially because Russia has suffered great losses due to the Patriots. However, since the whole world is uncomfortable with this situation, they have started to act as one body against Russia. It is not entirely clear what Russia, which is uncomfortable with Ukraine's advantageous position due to the Patriots, will do now. According to war analysts, Ukraine's political and military success allows Russia to make major threats in many areas. While these threats seriously destroy confidence in Russia, they also enable the Ukraine to take very big steps in response. At the very beginning of these steps, thanks to its successes in foreign policy, the Ukrainian army is getting stronger day by day and managing to take the whole world with it. Thanks to the many events underlying these successes, Ukraine has now evolved to a different point. Thanks to this point that Ukraine has evolved to, it is not entirely predictable what Russia will do, because if Russia does not win the war, Ukraine will continue on its path as a major regional power. And this is recorded as the thing Putin wants the least. Even the possibility of this frightens Putin, and he is starting to adopt more and more aggressive policies because of this threat to his power. This once again shows everyone that Putin will be the end of Russia. Ukraine celebrates as the last of Russia's forces are pushed out of their country. Putin sits at his desk, staring into nothingness as the reality of what has happened sinks in. Suddenly, a group of masked men burst through the doors. They entered with their guns raised. The president of Russia screeched in horror as the masked men opened fire. Vladimir Putin is no more. The nation he once controlled splinters into different factions as power-hungry regional leaders fight for control. The hypothetical scenario that's about to play out is one of many possibilities. Vladimir Putin is unpredictable. But what happens when he is gone might be even harder to anticipate. Numerous actors have their sights set on becoming the next ruler of Russia, but the fight to control the country might very well lead to its collapse into several different nations. This will lead to the destabilization of the largest country in the world and will lead to death, destruction, and a world that teeters on the edge of oblivion. Putin is no longer the ruler of Russia due to the bullet lodged in his head, although those who were close to him still have power and control aspects of the military. The presidential envoys of the 8 districts of Russia are now vying for power. They threaten one another with war and economic instability. No one can agree on who should rule the country now that their fearless leader is dead. Threats turn to violence. Russia splinters, and war breaks out along its borders. Each of the 8 districts claims sovereignty and begins establishing its own government. The whole world watches as Russia's civil war grows to a size that has never been seen before. In the event that Putin lost power, Mikhail Mishaktin was intended to take over. And the Kremlin's internal divisions? They are concerned that he will treat Western leaders too leniently. They worry that Western incursions into Russian land will endanger their way of life. Mishustin's body is located in his car after Putin is discovered dead. Clearly, there was wrongdoing. The Central Russian Federation now exists where the Central Federal District once stood. Igor Shiyagarath is in charge of this newly formed country. Prior to becoming the Minister of Communications and Mass Media, he served as Putin's press assistant. Shield Life was appointed envoy to the Central Federal District when Putin restructured Russia's districts. He now asserts his control over Moscow and the remaining area that was once under his authority. Shogeg launches a massive disinformation campaign against the other recently formed nations in an effort to reassert Moscow's control over their people. He does this by using the knowledge and abilities he acquired while serving as Minister of Communications. But only those in the Central Russian Federation understand what he's saying. The other 8 districts, which span 251,000 square miles of territory and have a population of about 38 million, are now governed by their own governments, and Liv no longer has authority over the media or any of them. Given that this new country neighbors Ukraine and is a part of Europe, Shodiv has a lot to be concerned about if he wants to hold on to power. Even though this region of Russia once had a GDP of 407 billion euros, much of that money came from businesses and real estate that no longer exist as a result of the division in the country. There are enemies on all sides. The Central Russian Federation has a cohesive community because nearly 90% of the people identify as Russian. Due to the conflict in Ukraine, a sizable portion of the Russian force is already present in this area. As a result, those in need have access to numerous weapons and military equipment. The objective of Shokliks is to persuade the other countries to band together in order to present a united front and bring the country back together. However, given that the leaders of those nations have already started defending their borders and asserting Moscow's sovereignty, it doesn't appear probable that this will occur. Without unrestricted access to the vast resources of the remainder of what was once Russia, the Central Russian Federation struggles to survive, and the country's government is constantly under pressure from the West. The North is extremely concerned. The old Northwest Federal District gave rise to the Northwest Russian Federation. St. Petersburg, the country's new capital, is 651,000 square miles bigger than the territory that shoplifters control from a fortified structure in St. Petersburg. Alexander Gutsin, the new president, presides with a strict hand. With 13.6 million people living within his borders, he has a unique knowledge of the military resources present there thanks to his previous membership in the Russian Security Council. Gutsin takes advantage of his status. Even though it was unimaginable during Putin's reign, he used the Baltic Sea to transport products into and out of his new country. As Finland's military has been expanding, and as a result of Russia's disintegration, Gutsin has attempted to make peace with the Finnish government. However, he is unable to wage war on multiple fronts at this time. Instead, he makes an effort to persuade Finland and the rest of Europe that his new Russian Federation in the northwest can be an ally and, given enough time, might ultimately join the European Union. Goodson is opposed to this for completely selfless motives. Instead, he believes that by uniting with Finland and the rest of the EU, he can prevent the other countries that have arisen from Russia's dissolution from attacking his new country. Historically, the Northwest Federal District contributed 10% of Russia's GDP, or roughly €129 billion yearly. The area produces a significant amount of industrial output, and its agriculture industry can support the people inside the borders of the new nation. Although 3 other developing nations surround northwest Russia, the crops are so abundant that Goodson starts negotiating trade agreements with the rest of Europe in the hopes that they will reinforce his new nation's ties to the West. They all lie to the south in operation. This enables the military of Goodson to concentrate its defensive efforts along a single border, just like all of the new countries that broke away from Moscow. After Putin's death, the Russian Federation in the northwest must make sure to watch out for its allies. For the time being, Goodson's nation is in a strong position, despite the fact that this new nation has a lot of economic power that other leaders might desire. When Putin was in control, the Crimean Peninsula was governed by the Southern Federal District. However, this is no longer the case. The Southern Russian Federation, formerly known as the Southern Federal District, was less fortunate. The Ukraine is reclaiming its territory. One of the most important trade centers for the Southern Russian Federation has been lost. To make things worse, Ukraine still holds the Southern Russian Federation personally responsible for many of the atrocities that took place during the battle to retake Crimea. Ukraine has not forgotten the heinous deeds of the Russian invasion. The leader of this new country is Vladimir Vasilievich Ustinov, who is frantically trying to fortify the border with Ukraine. While their country recovers from the effects of war, the Ukrainian military has no current intentions to invade. The Russian Federation in the south might not be as fortunate. The only thing he has going for him is that his country was able to keep control of the Black Sea Navy when Russia disintegrated. He now has control over the local Black Sea waters thanks to this. Rostov-on-Don, which is located across the Sea of Azov from Crimea, is used enough to govern the Southern Russian Federation. Its location serves as a continuous reminder of the impending threat to the Southern Russian Federation. However, access to the Black Sea enables commerce to continue to be robust within the country, as in the northwest of the Russian Federation. Christoph makes a valiant effort to mend fences with Europe. If his new nation doesn't receive some protection from its neighbors, including Ukraine, there is no chance it will survive. Although not much justice was carried out while he was Russia's Minister of Justice, Ustinov is well versed in international law. He makes use of this expertise to request assistance from various UN agencies. Additionally, Ustinov works to forge stronger links between his country and Kazakhstan. Prime Minister Ali Khan, however, is unwilling to let his nation join any of the new nations. Ustinov must therefore depend on the 13.8 million people who live within the 162,000 square mile borders of the Southern Russian Federation due to potential retaliation from other regional powers. He uses the Caspian Sea shelf's coal and oil deposits to support the development of a new country. Mineral fluids are bought and transported across the Black Sea for sale on the world market. The Southern Federation of Russia has a GDP of about €81 billion overall, which is not bad given its smaller size and similarity to some of its peers. Federation is able to sustain its people by producing enough food on its lands and gathering enough marine resources from the nearby seas. The ongoing threat of conflict is the only thing preventing this new country from thriving. Around it all, the North Caucasian Russian Federation, or NCRF, is the tiniest country to have resulted from the dissolution of Russia. It was formerly known as the North Caucasian Federal District prior to its separation from the homeland. Petigo, Orsk, a 65,800 square mile city in the south of the country, is home to its governmental center. The NCRF, which has a population of just under 10 million, is not the most potent country to emerge from Russia's breakup. As the new nation's leader and a former prosecutor general of Russia, Yuri Chaika instantly imposes martial law. Because only about 30% of his people identify as Russian, he does this. Several ethnic minorities in the area have expressed the desire to have their own independent state. 9 people in the community identify as Avars, and nearly 15% of the population is Chechen. Nearly as many individuals belong to just the 2 ethnic groups as those who identify as Russian. Chaika is aware that he requires assistance, otherwise, the NCRF risks experiencing the same fate as the rest of Russia. He requests assistance from Georgian President Saloma Zurabishvili. In response, she says that George will only support the NCRF if martial law is lifted and negotiations to guarantee that all ethnic groups have equitable rights in the new nation start. Chaika is steadfast in his refusal to relinquish control over the populace and carries on as normal, but if nothing changes, his country will perish. His creation is being steadily destroyed by his people. It wouldn't take long for uprisings to spread throughout the NCRF. If a civil war breaks out within the NRF, any foreign country that wants to claim its territory only needs to wait until then and invade once the opposite sides have weakened one another. The NCRF loses ground as the other new nations that resulted from Russia's dissolution strengthen their positions. The local populace will take back their homes from Yuri Chaika because they have been subjugated for far too long. A Volga after the Central Russian Federation, the Russian Federation, also referred to simply as Volga, is the nation with the second largest population. Within its 400,000 square miles of territory, there are about 30 million inhabitants. Nizhny Novgorod, in the center of this new nation's land, serves as its capital. Access between Moscow and the Volga is comparatively simple thanks to the availability of roads and railroads. Capital of the Russian Federation. Igor Shakali of the Central Russian Federation and Igor Komarev, the present ruler of the Volga, have held discussions. These two leaders are aware that they have the power to unite all of the Russian territories if they can set aside their differences and work together. They would have to capture each one by force once more. But if they could just cooperate, they would have the personnel and resources to do so. This is easier said than done, though. Before leading the United Rocket and Space Corporation and later serving as Director General of the State Corporation for Space Activities, Komarev was an industrialist. He has access to some of the top scientists, engineers, and pilots in what was formerly Russia and has lofty aspirations. Komarev is aware that the Volga-Russia Federation is at least one of the biggest new countries. Russia's disintegration has resulted in the loss of a significant amount of industry. The majority of the railways linking Southeast Asia and Europe are under Komarev's authority, including those in this newly formed country. The Volga-Russian Federation has a GDP that is similar to the largest, at about 133 billion euros annually. Due to its position to the east of the Central Russian Federation and the Southern Russian Federation, it is shielded from any European aggression. Additionally, Komarev has made an effort to persuade Kazakhstan to support him. He mentions Kazakhstan's and former Russia's shared space exploration history. There is still the Baikonur Cosmodrome there. By extending their borders and offering funding for a combined space program in exchange for Kazakhstan's allegiance, Komarev and Kazakhstan can jointly launch aerial attacks against any foe and increase the power of both nations. This causes Kazakhstan's top officials to hesitate. Joint activities are discussed. Many of the satellites that Russia launched into orbit while Komarev served as Director General are in his possession, and he intends to use them to eavesdrop on his adversaries. Additionally, he intends to build a brand new space habitat that will be used only by Volga pilots in order to carry out research and stake a claim to space for his nation. Which are grand plans will require a lot of resources, but if everything proceeds as planned, Komarov could gain influence over the other countries in his region. He has access to modern missiles and sizable stocks of tanks from the Soviet period, and if he can persuade another country to join him, their alliance may be unstoppable. The possibility of Komarov's dreams arises from the fact that more than 80% of the former Russian automobile industry is located within its boundaries. More significantly, about 60% of Russian airplanes and 30% of its military equipment were produced in the Volga-Russian Federation. Nobody has anything like the new nation's industrial potential. Komarev does not hold back when threatening the Central Russian Federation or anyone else in the Volga region because of this. A Volga, it will only be a question of time before the Russian Federation pursues the other countries if it can forge an alliance with Kazakhstan. The Russian Federation is a force to be reckoned with. There is one region, though, that might be able to choke the Volga to death. The Ural-Russian Federation is this country. This new nation is larger in size than every territory to its west. What defines the Euro-Russian Federation, though? Its natural gas and hydrocarbon reserves are extremely potent. This country not only has abundant fossil fuel reserves but also must pass through the European Russian Federation to access its western territories. Vladimir Vladimirovich Yakushev is the president of the Euro-Russian Federation. He has experience building up the infrastructure of his new country because he was previously the Minister of Construction, Housing, and Utilities. It has the second largest economy among the new countries, behind the Central Russian Federation, with a GDP of 141 billion euros. Yakushev, however, is not overly concerned. This is because without the natural riches he controls, the Western nations will collapse. Yakushev is in charge of 702,100 square miles of territory and about 12 million people. He is in charge from Ekaterinburg, in the center of the nation. The Ural region supplied about 90% of Russia's natural gas and 68% of its oil before the nation was divided. This implies that the European Russian Federation is in control of the region's energy supply, regardless of how advanced the other militaries or their technology may be. And for this reason, Yakushev possesses no phobias toward the Volga, the Russian Federation, or any other country. Yakushev establishes strong alliances with the help of his new nation's abundant resources and riches. Despite their original pledge to refrain from interfering in the internal affairs of Russia as it broke up into 8 new countries, China is growing closer to the Russian Federation. Vladimir Vladimirovich Yakushev is not afraid to remind other leaders of the leverage he has in exchange for the natural resources China provides the Euro-Russian. Oil and natural gas are strong motivators during talks. Vehicles and weaponry of the Federation. Yakushev. With every day that goes by, the nation grows stronger. The Siberian Russian Federation is located east of the Ural Russian Federation. This new nation surpasses all other nations in terms of size. 1,684,100 square miles of its land are occupied by a population of just over 17 million. Using a spy network he developed based on his experience in the KGB, Anatoly Shatershev controls this country through terror. The Siberian Russian Federation's center is Novosibirsky. It is located in the center of Asia. Along the Yuba River, Sarachek is aware that he will require allies despite having more territory than the majority of the nations in the area. He turns to Mongolia for an alliance if he wants to compete with countries like the Volga or the Ural Russian Federation. By forging strong ties with neighbors, Sarachek believes that he will no longer need to worry about defending his western and eastern borders. The Mongolian government is reluctant to join any alliance without first consulting China. Russian Federation. Sarachek may be out of luck, too, as the Chinese appear to be making a deal with the young woman. The Russian. In order to power its cities and towns, the Russian Federation generates a lot of bituminous coal. It is an unclean source of energy that contaminates the air in and around large towns. Manufacturing hubs start to get sooty, which makes me think of the British Industrial Revolution. The country also generates a lot of aluminum, which it sells to neighboring governments in exchange for money to buy food. If Sarachek can't come to an agreement with one of his neighbors to secure, the Siberian Russian Federation's people are constantly in need of food because the region's lands are not fertile. For his people, more products he might be dealing with a revolt. Southeast Asia. The biggest of the countries that emerged from the fall of Putin's Russia is the Russian Federation. It is, however, the least inhabited. 8 million individuals live on its 2,684,400 square miles of land. The country now has 3.1 individuals per square mile of land area. This is 50 times less concentrated than the Central Russian Federation and almost 3 times less than the Siberian Federation of Russia. This indicates that Yuri Trutnov controls a large amount of vacant property in the far eastern Russian Federation. Prior to taking over the region when Russia disintegrated, Trutnov worked as Russia's Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment. This new nation's emphasis on ecology sets it apart. Even though Trutnov continues to be an autocrat who governs from Vladivostok, he has devoted a lot of his time to safeguarding the distinctive ecosystems that exist there. Trutnov was the government official in Russia with the greatest income in 2008 and 2009. 55 million rubles, or roughly $5.34 million, were earned by him during this period. In addition to securing control in the far eastern Russian Federation, he has used his wealth to support environmental causes. The new country's GDP is only about 73 billion euros, with the majority of its income coming from manufacturing equipment and running a sizable portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The nation's citizens also support the economy by selling timber, going fishing, hunting, and trapping furs. In the area, the far eastern Russian Federation adopts an isolated attitude. It can engage in marine activities because it has access to the Pacific. Trading occurs when the waters around its ports are not frozen during certain times of the year, but Trutnov and the other residents of the area have almost all the resources they require within their boundaries. Only because there are so few humans does the environment support them. Since they are so far from the majority of the ruthless tyrants who have seized power in the new countries that emerged after the breakup of Russia, the far eastern Russian Federation has sworn to stay out of any conflicts that should develop in the area. The neutrality of the Russian Federation in the Far East should not be interpreted as an assurance that the country lacks a significant military, or find a method to increase production in times of war so that any invasion would result in a short conflict that Trutnov would lose. The entire world watched as Russia was divided into 8 separate countries after Vladimir Putin's death. Over time, armies from some of these new nations clashed because they were more aggressive than others. Many of the powerful individuals desired the reunification of Russia, but only if they could govern over it. Every revolution began in a country where an ethnic minority was fighting for freedom. The Russian people, who were tired of living under dictators, were at the mercy of other nations. The world then watched in horror as each country either prospered or became engulfed in war. The nuclear arsenal of Russia was divided among the various leaders when it broke up into separate nations. There were nuclear weapons available to all of the new countries. The big weapons came out as the tightly packed nations of what was formerly Russia clashed with one another in the West. The United States, Europe, or NATO were not the targets of the nuclear weapons this time, though. They were facing each other. The 8 Russian states each fired a nuclear missile at the other in an effort to annihilate the other side's troops, neutralize the resistance, or protect their own boundaries. A nuclear holocaust resulted from the war between the 8 countries that emerged from Russia's breakup. Years must pass before the land is radiation-free, at which point a new country will emerge from the ruins. Watch now to see why Poland is preparing for an all-out conflict with Russia. Or take a look at Russia's one alteration. Putin was unable to foresee a conflict in Ukraine.